It's April 30th. Chauncey Billups rhymes with Wilson Phillips, and it's ClipperBlog Live. Andrew Hahn here with our normal panelists, Charlie Widows,
Hello.
Nick Flint, and three guests today, Jordan Heimer,
Welcome.
Kevin Arnovitz, and from the OC Register, Dan Woike.
How's it going?
Dan, let's start with you. What did you think of last night's crazy comeback?
I thought it was crazy. Let me lead with that. No, I thought it was something where it was a very Clipper game, but it was just kind of exacerbated in terms of, getting down as much as they got down and the speed at which they came back. I mean, these are things they've done, all year. I think Chris Paul said it best in the post game when he was like, "Unfortunately, this is just how we play," and it's just kind of who they are. They're just this giant tease, and sometimes you're going to get some, and sometimes you're not. It's kind of how I look at them as a team.
What I thought was different. I mean, there were so many things obviously about the win last night that were different. But one thing they haven't done all season is Vinny has gotten a lot of criticism for not mixing and matching his lineups and being creative. And that stretch lineup of Bledsoe and Evans and then Kmart on just the last play and Nick Young obviously for all of it. These are things that Clipper fans have wanted Vinny to do all season, is go with Chris Paul and Bledsoe in the same backcourt. And lo and behold, the eight most important minutes of the last 6 years, that was your backcourt for basically the first time all season. So, give Vinny credit. We all criticize when there are times to criticize, but give Vinny credit for coaching a hell of an 8 minutes, if not the first 40.
The environment was just insane. There's this kinetic energy and nervous anxiety you feel at an arena or ballpark when a team is blowing a lead like air being let out of a balloon. And it was sort of incredible being on press row. First of all, what was wonderful about it was everyone kind of broke character after the win. Chris, as you know, in a locker room, and Dan's been in there a million times, he's the perfectionist. He's the parent who, if you bring home A's and A minuses, is like, why didn't you get all A's? I mean, even after a victory, he sort of refuses to accept the fact that the Clippers have arrived anywhere meaningful. And here he was, like, regaling you with stories. And, like, when he got up on that podium, and some of you might have seen the NBA TV replay, there he was, oh, yeah, and there was this other great play that Eric Bledsoe made. And the PR staffers who are normally just sort of, who've probably done hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of games this time, I mean, they were high-fiving. Mark Ivoroni, who had been heckled incessantly from fans behind the Clippers bench because of his tenure in Memphis, which wasn't terribly successful from a win-loss standpoint, like, as the buzzer sounded, like, he got up and he just, like, yelled back at them. And it was just everyone, I mean, security guards they must be like 90 years old and just half in the ground were just indignant. The arena had a feeling of just disbelief collectively. Fans, the Clippers, everyone. And it was truly just one of those games where, reporters on press row were just looking at each other and said, hey, you got any leads I can borrow? And those who'd seen 40 years of basketball professed never to have seen anything like it. It's historic. It truly will be. It is an instant classic.
Yeah, I think I probably oversimplified it by saying this is who the Clippers have been all year. but I think I want to touch on the point you made about the arena in these situations. Whether it's basketball or football, when you're on the road and you come back, that silence really drives the team that's coming back. I mean, I think that's something that doesn't necessarily always get played on TV, but like when a place is that loud and it gets that quiet, like one of the coolest things I've ever seen as a sports writer in my entire life was covering a USC Ohio State game at Ohio State when USC scored a last-second touchdown and there's 115,000 people in there and nobody's making any noise, and it's really incredible. And you could sense, I think, on TV the weight of, oh my gosh, we're doing this on national TV. We're the team that's giving this away, and the crowd was awesome.
Chris said two interesting things in the press conference. The first was he was really happy they started on the road. And this wasn't a case where, oh, sour grapes, we blew it. I mean, he said that, he's like, I love being on the road. He's like, I was telling Eric Bledsoe this before the game, that just there's nothing more satisfying than quieting a crowd. And there's an energy that you can, they always talk about the home team feeding off the energy. And he was, his point was, actually completely muting that energy is, you derive so much more from that. The other thing he said, which was hilarious, someone had asked him, the way you guys came back. He's like, unfortunately, this is how we play. An acknowledgement that, like, this is what we do and we shouldn't really do. And then old Chris kind of came back, where it's like, well, we shouldn't have been down in the first place, and to have to stage this kind of rally. But it was the other thing that was interesting is, and this is maybe not of great relevance, but it was fun seeing Chris and Blake share a podium. Because I think one of the great hallmarks of playoff basketball is the ceremonial stars coming into the post-game interview room. And of course, as fans may or may not know, generally in a regular season game, the media files into the locker room, you sort of, huddle around a locker, get a report. But in the playoffs, starting from the very first game, no matter where you are, Indiana, Clippers, whoever, the podium is set up, and the bigger stars are asked to, rather than address the media at the locker, kind of go up on the podium. And it's interesting. You can measure the dynamics of Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant, or the way LeBron James and Dwayne Wade shared a podium last season and this season in Miami. And it was fun seeing Griffin and Paul sort of like, okay, here it is, with the NBA playoff mural behind them, and sharing that. There's a human chemistry that you observe in that context that's beyond what you might just see on the court in a pick and roll.
Neil O'Shea actually had kind of an interesting comment that follows up on what Dan was saying about the road arena feel. I know Kevin and DJ and maybe others have mentioned that maybe it's not such a bad thing that the Clippers are starting on the road, because it took a little bit of the pressure off them and made them an underdog to some extent. Neil O'Shea had comments where he basically said, thank God we didn't have that start at home, where you can feel the the air going out of your home crowd. And all of a sudden, when you're away, they're already against you. They're still against you. They continue to be against you. You can actually maintain a little bit of presence. And he was saying if we'd had that start at home, it would have been a disaster. Obviously, it was a disaster as it was. But I thought that was an interesting point.
Yeah, Kevin, I noticed that podium thing, too. I thought that was very cool. And there was even one moment where a question was kind of asked to both of them, and Blake started talking, and Chris kind of took it from him. Yeah. And it was like seeing these two studs on the podium together, but one of them's been there a lot, and the other one gets a few words, and that's all for him. Speaking of opening on the road, it looked to me on TV, and you can speak to this, and Dan, you can speak to what you've seen during the year. It looked to me like for the first time they got punched in the mouth to start a game, and I had not. Tell me first of all if you noticed that or not, and second, have you seen that this year? I've never know. Of all the things you could say about the Clippers, I didn't see them get beat up to start games very often.
Yeah, really the only time I can remember it to a certain extent was I think when they lost to Golden State and Darrell Wright got really, really hot in the first quarter. That was like kind of the one game where they got off to just a pretty dreadful start. And it's similar, good three-point shooting. And they haven't defended the three-point line very well in general this season. And when, teams hit shots like that, they can kind of, like you saw with Nick Young coming back, 3 in a row, takes a 12-point lead to 3, totally changes the momentum, the complexion of the game. That's kind of what happened, I think, in this game, too. And what happened in that Golden State game was, a guy makes 3 or 4 threes in a short amount of time, and it just totally changes everything. I mean, that's the only game that I can really think of where they got hit first. Usually they're the team that punches and then kind of says, okay, well, the second unit comes in and then nobody scores for 15 minutes and, all of a sudden it's a game again.
All right, I guess I'll you going, Charlie?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, they literally did seem to get punched. I mean, it was physically, not just kind of outplayed, but there was a physical presence that Memphis brought that I hadn't seen the Clippers not match or not initiate even before.
We just had a Free Nick Flint little protest on the chat there. I'll kind of segue. You know, we talked plenty about what happened, but following up this whatever greatest comeback of all time, best game in Clippers history, multiple descriptors I've heard recently.
I love how you put it all in quotes, like it wasn't that good a comeback.
I know. That is my way. I can't help it. But what do we see going forward? I don't know if you guys have seen it, but there have been the numbers last season. The Mavericks allowed Portland to the massive Brandon Roy comeback. New Jersey against Boston. All of these teams, eventually the comeback, the team that made the comeback falls in the series. Do we see some correlation there with the Clippers going forward? Do we see that team as this team as one that's going to collapse down the stretch here, or what?
I mean, this is where I would agree and kind of, I wouldn't say be a pessimist, but I'll be a realist. I mean, the only other game, and Kenyon Martin brought it up in the locker room, is he was on the losing end of a New Jersey blown lead, 21 points entering the fourth quarter to Boston, and sure enough, New Jersey ended up going to the finals. You brought up a thing. I do believe this. It was a phenomenal victory, instant classic, something to celebrate. Sometimes games can exist in a vacuum, and we can talk about them for ages. Do I think it's any more valuable than had the Clippers, won by 6, holding off a moderate lead down the stretch? No. And if anything, I think it will embolden Memphis. You think that's going to happen to them again? Or you think they're not going to? They're going to go back into the prevent defense in the four corners? I'm with Nick here. I don't think it carries any import. The notion that it will demoralize Memphis and you can't recover from something like this just doesn't have any weight in history. There's just nothing empirically to support that. Particularly this team that I think, just observing them a little bit here and there, I think Memphis is a pretty, from a character standpoint, I mean, they're a pretty solid team and they're well coached. They've got a good staff. And so I'm with Nick on this. We can celebrate victory on the Clippers' behalf, but I don't think it carries anything other than the Clippers got home court advantage now. They're up 1-0, and they stole the first of potentially 2 in Memphis.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think with Memphis, they're certainly the problems that they had while the Clippers were coming back, I think, are fairly fixable. They ignored Marc Gasol, a guy who played great in the first half, and some of that was the Clippers and the way they defended it, but it was also some of it that it was like, that I think they just kind of got away from it, and I think when you're the team that gets embarrassed like that, because that was embarrassing. It would have been embarrassing had the Clippers lost by 30, which certainly looked like they were, but I think it's embarrassing to be, just as if not more embarrassing to be the team that coughed it up. They can come back in these 2 days, and they're going to do a lot of introspection, and they're going to make big adjustments, I would imagine. And, that's the question for the Clippers and for Vinny Del Negro is, are they going to be able to look at this game and to examine the things that went wrong and make the right adjustments in moving forwards?
Yeah, I guess my question to you, Dan, would be I think plenty of us are skeptical about the Clippers' capabilities to make adjustments.
Why would you be skeptical? That's crazy.
I mean, from afar, it seems like the formula, and this is part of their DNA. They come back. They do this. It seems like the formula is pretty much the same. I mean, I could be wrong about this, but Bledsoe energy, Reggie Evans rebounding, Kenyon Martin, guarding 4 positions. These guys, do you think they understand why that works for them?
I don't know, which is scary, to be 100% honest. But I think it's something with them. They've really, I think this year, been so focused on themselves because of the high turnover in players, because, once they get into a groove, a guy gets hurt, or once they get into a groove, they sign somebody, and then they get another groove, and then they trade for somebody. And they've been in this constant motion all year where, and then they haven't been practicing. So I think that they've really always kind of focused internally more, and maybe, because they knew it was going to be Memphis for a few weeks, because they've kind of figured out who they are maybe over the last month of the season, that maybe that's, if you want to look for a place to be optimistic, that they can make these adjustments, that they will. But that's not really necessarily Vinny's track record, though, either, is somebody who's willing to, kind of throw the book away and say, okay, this is, that was, you're right. Like, that was something I forgot who said it, but about last night, I think it was you, Charlie, who was like, this is the lineup that it seems like it's been working for a while.
Right.
And they went with it and they stayed with it. And that's just really not them.
Kevin, I've got a question for you. Caron Butler broke his left hand yesterday in the third quarter. Do we know what the Clippers are going to do about that, and how does that impact their series hopes and playoff hopes going forward?
Then he was non-committal, as he should be, at practice today. I think he's considering Bobby Simmons. More, I think, for Bobby's size and length against Rudy Gay. It's just a really tough matchup. Rudy beat up Caron pretty bad yesterday. I think that was one area, that Memphis cited that they did very well on. And that coupled with, I think, someone mentioned it earlier, that Nick kind of fits into that the generally kind of schizophrenic or just more ad hoc offense that comes in with the second unit. And I think to Dan's point earlier, he does fit with that unit. They need that firepower. You can come in, you can start Bobby in the first and third. He may end up playing only 18 to 20 minutes, but he might be the natural matchup for Rudy to the extent that Clippers have anybody. And this has always been, I think, the concern we've all had is what happens when a big wing, whether it's Durant, whether it's Rudy Gay, is the primary wing assignment. The Clippers just don't have anyone. I think the Caron injury is big. Right now, the Clippers are now officially without their starting wing tandem, Billups and Butler, and will now go the rest of the way with, a Foy, Nick Young, a Bobby Simmons, Mo Williams rotation, and that's just, it's dicey. I know Butler. I don't think many of us were huge fans of the signing, both in the less in the short term, more in the long term. He's limited. He's had too many knee surgeries, but Caron will be missed. Every minute Caron doesn't play is a minute Bobby Simmons probably plays, and that's just a drop off any way you look at it.
Kevin, is it fair to say that you think that Bobby should start more because Nick Young has value to the second team than Nick Young wouldn't be good enough in the starting lineup?
I don't think it's not good enough. I think here's the thing about Bobby. Is he a great individual defender? Not great, good. He just doesn't make mistakes in the half-court defense. And you watch him, he's a pretty cerebral defender. He understands rotations. He's played for a lot of good defensive coaches. And I think he's a better matchup on Rudy. He can give you 18 to 20 minutes on Rudy, and I think you'd take it. Kenyon's going to be interesting, too. I wonder if at any point, it's tough because that leaves them very unstretchy. But I'm wondering, they like Kenyon on Rudy, which is such an interesting dilemma because it's not like you're going to put Kenyon at the 3. But clearly there are situations whether I think now this might force Vinny's hand to play more zone because, maybe you do have Kenyon out there with 2 bigs. Not particularly down the stretch if you get into an offensive defense situation, but there are just a lot of things now for Vinny to consider, and he has a new variable to deal with in the equation, and it'll be interesting.
That was one thing I wanted to ask you, Kevin, was I think that this kind of gives them a chance to be a little more outside the box where they can go big and they can go small. They can do some different things, I think, with matchups where you can, like you mentioned with Kenyon, or, you could see them, I think, playing Chris Bledsoe and Nick Young together. I'm sorry, I caught that out of the corner of my eye. But, where you can do some stuff where they can go a little smaller, too, and try to push the pace. I think, if you went with Kenyon, obviously that gives them an extra physical presence. And to go back to one of Charlie's original points, he's not going to let him get punched, if he's out there. I think Bobby, too, is an underrated energy defender, especially at times this year. He's been a guy who, whether it's on the ball, like he's not very quick or anything like that, but he does play physical, and he's got very active hands. And I think he could play, a pretty positive role. I mean, obviously, you don't really think of Western Conference champion starting small forward Bobby Simmons.
No, and it would be helpful if he hit a shot every once in a while.
Yeah, that would help.
Yeah.
So let me ask you guys a question. Speaking of things like toughness and energy, DeAndre Jordan has pretty much spent the stretch of games on the bench since the All-Star game. And obviously last night, Reggie Evans was the right man for the right matchup, and he was amazing. But it's a strange thing to me, because if you look at the numbers, DeAndre Jordan is the best big man, non-Blake Griffin big man, in terms of, plus minus on the floor and how the team does with him and without him on the floor that the team has. And yet, if you looked at the way Vinny and the coaching staff use him, they clearly seem to be saying that they lack confidence that he can be the right guy down the stretch. There seems to me like there's a perception versus numbers thing happening there that doesn't quite add up. But maybe it really is true that he's not, quote, playoff tested and he doesn't have certain intangibles. What do you guys think about that, about how DJ is being used?
I just want to add one thing that there's a Twitter question that kind of goes along with what Jordan was saying. If Vinny's hand is forced and he has to play more unconventional lineups, he has to go rely more on the zone, does that mean that DJ and Blake just cannot play together because they're two very young, relatively inexperienced defenders? Kevin, you want to start us off?
I don't think their inexperience and youth is the commonality there. I think it's their lack of stretch. Now, we've talked about Blake being a pretty good mid-range shooter all of a sudden, and this has been going on for 6 weeks or so. He's in the high 40s, which is, now you're talking Bosch and even Dirk territory. But I think it's their lack of stretch that makes Vinny nervous. Though there's something else with DJ. I think Vinny doesn't love young emotional players, and I think there's clearly a trust issue there. I'm not trying to stir anything up. I think it's evident. I think you can assume that if you have an $11 million, we're molding him into Tyson Chandler's center, and he's not on the floor in crucial moments, it's fair to say that he's not playing because he hasn't engendered the trust of the coach. I don't think that's inflammatory, but clearly it's the case. I also think that Kenyon Martin's a very nice security blanket for a coach trying to, figure out solutions in the fourth quarter. Kenyon is a guy you can switch now, late in the shot clock, and that the Clippers do that. He fundamentally understands zone defenses. I don't like what Kenyon gives them offensively any more than I like what DJ does, but there's a reliability that Vinny appreciates about Kenyon. I know the analytics don't really support Kenyon's presence on the floor, but Vinny sees something there, and last night, he got what he got what he wanted.
Kevin, one thing about, I guess, obviously last night, Kenyon and Reggie, in particular, won the day kind of off the bench. If I'm thinking of anything that Memphis can do different, I mean, they shot threes well. They did a lot of things better than we expected in the beginning. Would one area maybe we can look at where they can even improve would be their bigs off the bench, guys like Spates and Cunningham, being maybe outplaying the Clippers bigs?
I think they just got surprised by the Clippers' physicality down the stretch. I mean, the Clippers kind of switched and then switched again on those Conley pick and rolls after Chris Paul kind of threw up his hands after the fourth three-pointer. Vinny saying, look, this isn't working. They started plugging that pick and roll in the slot. They really started to push Gasol off the spot. I think if they score a few buckets, it's not even a question. The Clippers scored 30-something points, and that's a good quarter. We've seen 30-point quarters from the Clippers before. It was Memphis just completely getting away from their half-court game. They owned the middle of the floor in the first three quarters, really the first two quarters. The third quarter was really an inside-out quarter for them. And really, what they need to do is just get shots. If they don't have quick misses or turnovers, those three-pointers by Nick are probably one. And now we're talking about a 5-point game, and we're not even we're sitting here talking about the moral victory the Clippers achieved by bringing a 27-point deficit back to 6. So what does Memphis need to do? They need to score the ball. They need to get back in the middle of the floor. If Marc Gasol is getting pushed off the elbow, well, then they need to go back to those X cuts or whatever the hell they do. And that's basically it. I don't see the Grizzlies having that abject an offensive quarter again.
I think another thing with DeAndre is, maybe him and Blake I thought looked most affected by the size of the moment last night in terms of, I think of one play that happened in the second half where DeAndre got a rebound and fired an outlet pass to like midcourt and there's nobody there. Like he overshot it by, 5 or 6 feet. He had a couple drops and, around the rim and stuff like that. And I also thought though in stretches, his athleticism allowed them to get easy baskets at times when they weren't getting easy baskets. I know people online on Twitter especially like to say, oh, why are these guys throwing lobs? Don't they know they're down 30 and stuff like that? And part of me is thinking that's the only way they're scoring at times is, if you want to get DeAndre Jordan involved, you throw him a lob. You don't give him the ball to, do a two-step, a drop-step hook. Like that's not his game right now. So I thought that he was active enough above the rim, and he blocked a couple shots in the first half, got him a couple stops. I thought at times he did some good stuff.
Yeah, that's all great. Kevin, I know you're a very busy guy.
Thanks for coming on, Dan. That was great.
Trying to get you out of here. Places you need to be, Kevin. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, we'll do it again.
Enjoy the barbecue.
Oh, I will.
I have a couple more questions.
Southern lingo.
For our Clipper expert guests here. Dan, let's start with you. A lot of the talking heads, those silly guys on sports channels, are talking about how Memphis basically owned the Clippers for 3 quarters and then fell asleep in the 4th quarter. But when you look at the quarter-by-quarter point distribution, it's really like the 1st and 4th quarter that were anomalies. 34-16 for Memphis in the 1st, 35-13 for the Clippers in the 4th, and it's relatively even in the middle 2 quarters. Is this just the game of ultimate variance, and we can just throw out those first and last quarters?
I think to a certain extent. I think what I saw in those middle quarters and why it might maybe look like Memphis was dominating was their spurt ability was, the Clippers would put together like 4-0, 5-0, 6-0 runs to cut the lead down to like, it felt like every time they got to 13, something horrible would happen. I don't know if you guys noticed that too, where then, Connolly would make 3 threes in a row or something like that. And that's maybe why it seemed closer. I mean, I thought in stretches, the Clippers outplayed them in the 2nd and 3rd quarter, especially, I think I tweeted something early in the 3rd quarter that there felt like there was a little bit of a window to come back where they went to Blake a couple times, and they'd gotten some easy baskets, and they had gotten a couple stops, and then Connolly, hit, got hot and made his shot. So, I think you're right though, Andrew. I do think it's something where, both of those teams played really well while the other team played really poorly. And you saw that's what happens. I think mostly the series is going to be these teams kind of hovering more towards who they are on a consistent basis. And that's why people think it's going to be so close.
Right. I think the truth, as it almost always does, lies somewhere in between. And those 1st and 4th quarters were a combination of kind of the very explicable and the completely inexplicable. The completely every game is its own thing and no analytics can teach us what's going to happen in a game. Like in the 1st quarter, there were it wasn't just that Memphis was out of their mind shooting, although that was part of it. It was also that the Clippers weren't able to run their offense at all. Blake Griffin was being double-teamed when he caught the ball immediately. Chris Paul was not able to run that side pick and roll that basically is the Clippers' offense. He was coming around the corner and there was instantly somebody there. Conley actually, I think, did a better job on him in the 1st quarter than Tony Allen did on him down the stretch, which I thought was a really interesting thing because, this gospel of Tony Allen being the greatest perimeter defender since Scottie Pippen has become almost just accepted truth, but wasn't necessarily on – what? Yeah, he's really good. He's really good. It was just interesting to see where the rubber meets the road. He's good, but he's not perfect, and Mike Conley did more than an adequate job in the 1st half. And, same thing in the 4th quarter. Were the Clippers 27 points better than Memphis or whatever in the 4th quarter? Of course not. But they were finally able to start doing some of the things that their offense depends on. Charlie, you got stuff?
No, I was just going to say, whatever numbers you can take from any game, this was even just another completely different situation. I mean, as you guys were talking about, as Dan, you said, they were shook. Chris Paul was shook. I'd never have seen this before. I mean, we can talk about the young team or, lack of experience. Chris Paul came out and, as I said last night, he made a jump pass to DeAndre Jordan running down the lane, which DeAndre was completely unprepared for. I mean, as I said, point guards who are not shook don't make those kinds of plays, and Chris Paul never does. And so, we look at what DeAndre does on the court and off the court, and part of it is, well, frankly, he plays with Chris Paul a lot and Blake Griffin, and that makes your plus-minus numbers look really good. And also, certain games, different matchups just go a certain way. Kenyon Martin was playing great. But the other thing is, as much as he's improved, DeAndre Jordan still can't shoot free throws, and I would hope if I'm a Memphis fan that Lionel Hollins would know to hack him if he's in the game down the stretch.
And Martin can't shoot free throws either.
Nor Reggie Evans.
No.
Or
Right.
Blake Griffin.
But those guys were doing
There's no one.
Right, exactly. So, well, and the other thing, speaking of all those guys, it did strike me that Vinny has been so good when dealt kind of a different hand. This guy goes out, or this, guy has foul trouble. And who knows if it's something he thought about the night before or whatever, but, game time comes, and, Dan, you've probably talked to him about this before. He throws some guys out there and they play hard.
Wait, true or false? This is the least appreciative podcast the night after a historic playoff comeback win in the short podcast history.
Oh, that's false.
Yeah.
Our cynicism's moved down.
Comebacks of all time were them appreciative.
I think the Clippers coach. No. I think with Vinny Del Negro, one of the ideas I was kicking around, and I'm not sure I can write it, just because I don't know that there's enough there, but is that he really does a good job of keeping blinders on. He doesn't talk about, when the reports about them losing the locker room and stuff like that, he was kind of, I don't want to say indifferent to it, but he was sort of like, whatever. I talked to Donald Sterling. He likes me. That's good enough for me. And I think he doesn't listen to us in terms of what we think. He doesn't care. And I think that's genuine. And I think it's a good thing because, when they're down like that, he doesn't, I think part of him's probably thinking about Derrick Rose, but he doesn't care that the blogosphere and Twitter's blowing up with people who are just all screaming at the computers. Why is Chris Paul in the game? Why is Blake Griffin still in this game? He just doesn't care. And he doesn't see things that way. And I think it's one of his, at times it's a huge disadvantage because it kind of limits his awareness, I think. But in general, I think it's kind of a strength that he's very true to himself. And I believe him when he says that all along he thought this process was going to go like this to a certain extent. I kind of buy that from him just because he seems like he hasn't really made any big changes to what he does. He's true to himself. He's coaching the best way he knows how to coach.
Dan, that's a great point, and it makes me think, might that have even rubbed off on the team? I mean, they're so flawed in so many ways, but it's just like, we don't care. We're going to be us, and, we're going to win a lot of games.
Yeah, Charlie, I think you're right. I think that was something they struggled with a lot during the season, is figuring out, the existential question of who they are as a team. They just didn't know it, and I do think maybe that's the team they are, is a team that just doesn't really care about conventions. You know what I mean? Conventionally, teams that are horrible free throw shooting teams shouldn't win close games. And I don't know the numbers. I feel like they're really good in close games. Obviously that's a reflection of Chris Paul. But in general, I mean, the guys around him, I mean, when we talk about improbabilities from last night, I mean, it's stuff like, making free throw, like Blake Griffin looked like an 85% free throw shooter making those free throws. He looks super confident, and it's just like I said, they don't care.
Segue alert. Number one, key for this team clearly during the season was finding themselves by reading a lot of Sartre. I hear that Karan is a huge existentialist guy. Great point bringing that one up.
They love reading. They all love reading.
Seriously. Blake Griffin in those commercials, take a class sometime, you guys. There's a huge connection subtext in there about finding yourself when talking to Yuvo and Funk. Anyway,
Yuvo is the subconscious. That's Blake Griffin's subconscious.
Quote Nietzsche.
Oh, all right. Hero ball. A part of understanding the self is trusting the collective. No, not true, probably. CP3, he plays a different kind of game, you could say. We saw Rudy Gay down the stretch last night, isolations for Memphis. I had to give the segue alert. You see how disjointed this is. Randy Foye improved over the course of the season. Reggie Evans made a clutch layup. That's really weird. Someone say something about this.
It was super weird. It was super weird. Jordan, go ahead. Do you think it was weird?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I mean, you use the term hero ball, and in a way, when we use hero ball, especially here in Los Angeles, we're referring to one person, right? I mean, Kobe Bryant is hero ball. He's going to take every shot, isolation, 2 guys on him, off his back leg, whatever. Chris Paul, it's still hero ball to me, in the sense that he is saying, I want the ball in my hands every possession. I want to be in the game down 27. He knows he's the best player. It's not like he's falsely modest. But for him, hero ball is, ball in my hands, I will make the right decision. And I trust that that right decision, by tautological definition, is the right decision and will lead to the highest percentage outcome. Will they always make the shot? No. But he understands that concept, that to be the hero, let's have this possession end in the highest percentage shot possible, even if that's a feed to Reggie Evans cutting down the lane. And that's amazing to me. I've never really watched a player like that.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that how he knew that Reggie Evans would catch that pass. I mean, guys who watch, I mean, people love Reggie Evans, and I've seen him drop more ball. I've seen him. I've seen him drop more passes this season. I mean, I think I joked earlier the year that the best way to pass it to him is to throw it off the rim, because that's when he tends to actually catch the ball. But it's in that situation, for him to catch a pass in traffic, to kind of maneuver his body, you're right, it was so improbable. I mean, I don't know, it defies logic, but I think there is something in just inside of Chris Paul that knows the right situations, the right place. I mean, he's the most aware basketball player I've ever seen in my life, in terms of whether it's knowing the clock. I think that the way that I would try to describe him to people who haven't been around him is that if you've ever played a board game with somebody who's so adherent to the rules and they know all these little loopholes, they know all these little tricks where it's not even fun anymore, I feel like that's sort of like Chris Paul, the basketball player, is he's the type of guy who would argue if you wanted to put $500 in free parking because that's not in the rules. That's this. I mean, he just knows these things, and he takes advantage of all of them. And it shows up in his flopping. It shows up in the way that he draws contact and can get fouled. You know what I mean? The foul he took on the fast break from, I think it was Tony Allen.
Or Allen, right.
Yeah, was crazy. I mean, he knew where he was going to step, and it wasn't a flop, but he made that contact, and he knew because it was important for them to get points with the clock stopped. I mean, he's just always aware.
Analogy alert. I'm going to say Kobe Bryant is like a ruthless dictator, probably South American country. Meanwhile, Chris Paul is like a really crafty local politician that just knows how to get it done for his constituents. And he also wears a suit very nicely, which I think plays into that.
He has a lot of good ties. He has a lot of good ties.
He really does.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just one more thing about hero ball, guys. I mean, I wish we'd asked Kevin, but what was with that Rudy Gay ISO? I mean, that's the definition of hero ball. He's not he's a good isolation player, but he's not super. He's not a great creator. And how do you just go with that? I mean, you have 2 guys that can create off the dribble.
I think they had Vinny Del Negro drawing up their out-of-timeout play there, actually. They thought he'd done such a nice job that Lionel invited him over, and that was what he came up with.
To be fair, though, Jordan, if that was true, Ryan Gums would have inbounded.
Memphis loves that Rudy Gay isolation down the stretch. They had, I think it was last season, famous game winner against the Heat. Pretty common. I think they had one against the Raptors that sent it to overtime too. So it's very strange to me, though. They went away from Marc Gasol down the stretch too, which I think was a bad idea. Obviously, in the playoffs last season, it was all about Zebo. I saw him in person make a step-back 3 against the Spurs to seal the deal, a crazy running hook. As good as Lionel Hollins can be out of timeouts and stuff, he still can fall victim to that, I guess, tunnel vision, you could say, coaches get, where it's like, okay, it's late in the game, we want the last shot, better run this ISO for our wing. It's just how it is sometimes, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, I mean, just seeing Paul, every year in the playoffs and now as a Clipper, it's made me appreciate the guys who are really good at passing, not just can pass out of the ISO, but create. I mean, LeBron James, I always get in arguments with him about that, or with friends about that. To me, LeBron James is the best because he can break you down and then find a wide open NBA player for a shot, and I think that's the same thing with Paul.
Yeah, that's a bit of the irony here, is that LeBron James and Chris Paul are basically the only ones that'll pass the ball in those kind of situations,
Right.
and LeBron's roundly lambasted for it.
Jordan did that a lot too. Well, not a lot, but he did it in some pretty high, important moments for Chicago where, he trusted it. And like I said with Chris Paul, he knew that, when he was coming back against the Knicks and he'd already scored 55 points, that, his turnaround was a lower percentage shot than an open Bill Wennington in the corner. You know what I mean? And he was comfortable enough as a player to pass there. And I always think that's kind of, it's a cop out. I mean, you do want a guy to be, I guess, have the guts to go win you a game, but winning you a game isn't always by shooting. And I think, to kind of go back to what Nick was saying about how teams kind of always fall into their I think teams do fall into their patterns, especially late in games, because when things are tight, you want to be as comfortable as possible. And I think the comfortable thing in those situations is to have, Rudy Gay try to break down a defender. And I just felt like, though, in that situation, it was like the way that they were scoring was, they could drive and kick. They could do a lot of different things with ball movement and make the Clippers be a good team defense, which is something they haven't done that for big, long stretches.
Maybe that's why the Clippers seem to succeed so well in late games and fourth quarters. Not only Nick Young bailing out, but defensively in late games, that's the only time you're going to see the Clippers do a good job defensively, because teams are going to attack them generally one-on-one. We saw it against Blake Griffin earlier in the season. Teams would attack him one-on-one, and that's the only defensive strength for the Clippers, basically, or the biggest defensive strength is isolation defense, post defense. So when those off-ball cuts stop happening, when the drive and kick stop happening, not even so much as a pick and roll, the Clippers were able, to finish the comeback and finish the game out and win it that way. That plays out nicely.
Yeah, I was going to say, that sounds like the best point we've made.
Yeah. Strong point, Nick.
Final question for Dan and Jordan. Nick, Charlie, and I, we all predicted that the Clippers would win Game 2 with varying final point totals. Who do you think is going to come out and take Game 2? Dan, let's start with you.
I like Memphis. I just think that they'll make the right adjustments, and really, because when you talk about playoff experience, I think playing in the moment is the first step of it, and the second step is feeling out the counterpunches and stuff like that. And I think that's what the Clippers have to learn. That was one thing Kenyon Martin said a lot in the lead up to the series, was that it's not so much the series doesn't start when a team loses at home. The series starts in Game 2 when you get to see the adjustments and how, when your A move doesn't work and your B move doesn't work and your C move doesn't work, then what do you do? And I think that's an area of concern, I think, a little bit for the Clippers, is that this is a team, whether it's for lack of practice time or lack of continuity, just hasn't developed a lot of counters and a lot of, wrinkles to plays. So I think that's kind of why I like Memphis, maybe by like 6. I don't know, 6 or 7.
Look, Dan, I hope you're wrong, because I have $1.8 million on the Clippers for Game 2.
Moneyheimer.
Yeah, I'm rolling deep these days with my EEE Seashells series netbook. But look, I do like the Clippers in Game 2, only because, like Charlie and Nick have pointed out, these guys Blake and DJ and even Chris Paul did look so off in the first quarter, and I just can't see that being replicated. And if you take that out of the equation, what you get is a hard-fought, gritty game, 48 minutes, and then Chris Paul at the end. And that has basically been the formula for Clippers victory all year, which is keep it close and let Chris Paul go do something in the last 4 minutes. And I'm hoping that's what we see in Game 2.
I did think all along that the most of all the scenarios that could happen in these first 2 games, I always thought that the Clippers winning 2 was always more likely than the Grizzlies winning 2. For whatever that's worth, it just felt that way. I mean, obviously a split seemed to me like that was probably what would happen, whether it was who wins Game 1 or who wins Game 2. I do think, though, because of Chris Paul, and like you said, Jordan, that, those guys didn't play well. Their best players didn't play well for big chunks of the game. I mean, even in the fourth quarter when they were coming back, I mean, there was that one stretch where they were down 13 and they turned the ball over 4 times or 3 times out of 4 possessions, and there was that horrible Nick Young jumper that was sandwiched in there. You know what I mean? Like a very Nick Young shot. And I think it was travel, bad Nick Young shot, travel.
Yep, that was it.
In a super crucial stretch. And they still
winning a game.
And that was when I changed the channel to watch Mad Men. True story.
Good for you. Yeah, no, I talked to my dad.
Killer
Actually,
episode.
I haven't seen it yet, so I was too busy working. But
Tough.
Yeah, get a job, you guys. No, I'm just I talked to my dad. I wrote about this on our blog over at the Register today. Was that I talked to my dad at halftime about this game, and then actually he did wake up and watch a little bit of the fourth quarter. And then after he saw that stretch of that 4 possession stretch, he's like, okay, I'm going back to bed. Like, and they still managed to get through so much of that adversity that, Jordan, maybe you're right. I mean, I think that if they put it together, I mean, obviously I think they're more talented. I think I don't know that they're a better team. I think they're certainly more capable of winning, though.
You think the Clippers are?
Yeah, I do. I really do.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. In a vacuum, cut out home court advantage, all the emotion, I would agree with that. My question to you would be, what adjustments does Memphis make? They were so damn efficient to start the game, and they, obviously they shot well, and that's fine, but, I don't know what they do.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they go to Gasol more. I mean, they try to go inside. I mean, but you're right. I don't know. I mean, if that was like sort of their best shot, then and they kind of figured it out there. That's all they have. I mean, this series is I think the Clippers are in a good spot because the Clippers really didn't do a lot of things that were characteristic in terms of Chris Paul looking rattled, Blake Griffin missing layups, even though we've seen that at times. But Karan was kind of caught in ISO hell, for a lot of the game. I mean, this wasn't them at their best by any stretch. So, if we see that 2 times this series, I mean, they could win in 5, I think.
I do just want to point out, Charlie, that it seems like everyone is perpetuating this myth that Memphis somehow fell in love with the 3-point shot and they were just shooting jump shots in that fourth quarter. And when looking back on it, they only had 3 shots in that entire quarter from outside of 18 feet, and one of them was actually a made 3-pointer by O.J. Mayo. The last field goal that Memphis made with like 9:25 left in the game. That sounds completely insane, but it doesn't seem like their formula had changed terribly in the fourth quarter. It was just, I don't know. I don't even know what it is. It's not Clippers.
Well, I mean, I think Bledsoe on the perimeter.
Miracle.
Okay. Well, this seems like a good point to end on since we've gone on for far too long. So for Charlie Widows, Nick Flint, Jordan Heimer, and Dan Woike, I'm Andrew Hahn. Thanks for tuning in.